One, two. Okay. Good morning, colleagues. Apologies for the delay. We're trying to make sure that we can get all the members. There's a lot of commitments leading to the midterm budget today. We've got an agenda before us, opening and welcome, apologies, and then we'll adopt, and then from there we'll allow Tips to give us a presentation. We will request, because many of the members, at least by 12, they must be released. We'll request that we just present high level. These are the documents that were engaged thoroughly yesterday. We had about 3-4 hours of engagement. The meeting is officially open. Can we receive apologies, Andre? It's on the side.
On the side?
Yeah. No. Here. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Oh, yeah. This is the first time. Good morning, everyone. We have an apology from Mr. Beasley, Mr. Msuzane, Ms. Zuma Sambudla, and Ms. Webster submitted apologies. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can we get a mover and seconder for the adoption of the agenda? Member Mluli, Member Kikaba, second. Thank you very much. Where's the delegation?
It's just
Okay. Thank you very much. We will then allow the DTIC. I'm not sure we are alone today. Who's there from the department?
They're all there.
Okay. Can we allow the department to introduce Mayor Makhetla, and then we can take it from there. DTIC.
Good morning, Chair and honorable members. My name is Debokho Magube from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. I'm the Acting Deputy Director General for the sectors. With me is Ms. Nyakalo Lambulo, who's the Director responsible for the steel industry, as well as Ms. Ngomisa Mhlauli, who's the Chief Director responsible for agro-processing, and she's also responsible for the sugar industry, cannabis, furniture industries in terms of the Masterplans, and accompanying us or through invitation is Tips, and it's led by the Chief Economist, Dr. Niva Makhetla, who will then take us through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are welcome. Doc, long time. I hope you are good. We apologize for the delay. We had a very long meeting yesterday. Over to you now. You probably, I don't know, you need an hour or so? Sorry?
I hope 45 minutes maximum.
Okay. We are all yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. We were asked to do an evaluation of the master plan project by the DPME and the DTIC. And I just want to say that TIPS is an independent research organization funded in large part by the DTIC, with whom we work quite closely. Yeah? So this is really looking at the master plan as a project, and the individual master plans as implementing that project, rather than the accomplishments that have been done in the individual sectors. So it was because it had been 5 years since the master plan approach was introduced. The evaluation aimed to identify new opportunities and areas for improvement. We finished it a few months ago. There have been some developments since then that are not captured in the documentation. And like I said, we were asked to do this by the DTIC and the DPME to see how they could also strengthen their work. And the methodology was that we looked at it again as the overall master plan project, with the individual plans then implementing the overall project, rather than looking at all of the individual plans and writing about them individually. There is a problem that there isn't actually a published policy document. As you know, there were presentations to this committee. There were other kinds of presentations, but there wasn't like a white paper or a green paper that you could say this is the actual policy. and was also included in some speeches. And it comes out of the concept of a reimagined industrial strategy. And the thing about those presentations also to this committee was that they focused on the process. They didn't actually say what was the aim of the process explicitly. That was kind of assumed. So we said we would use the overall DTIC vision, which is a dynamic, industrial, and globally competitive South African economy with meaningful economic transformation, inclusive growth and development, decent employment and equity, built on the full potential of all citizens. In other words, it's not just about growth, it's also about inclusion. And that was then important when it becomes, for evaluation, you obviously have to say, how did you do against your objectives? So we were assuming inclusion, which was a core objective of our industrial policy as a country. And from that standpoint, we were saying there were two structural challenges that have to be addressed, that these graphs kind of illustrate. If you look at the right, we have those bars show the share of the working age population with employment compared to other regions and countries that are upper middle income economies. And what you can see is the employment ratio in South Africa is around 40%, and that's been true since the 1980s. Whereas in other upper middle income countries, it's closer to around 60%. And that the really big difference is actually in self-employment, that because apartheid destroyed African-owned businesses, we end up with very low self-employment compared to other countries, and that is the immediate cause behind very low employment in South Africa. Now, that doesn't mean you can simply reconstitute self-employment and small-scale farming. So, because it happened historically doesn't mean you can just turn the clock back. But it does mean that we need to understand there are these deep structural factors. It's not just about growth. And then the other thing is that if you look at the structure of our exports, we are actually unusually dependent on exports of minerals compared to other developing countries. So if you include coal, it's a much higher share of our exports, well over half compared to other countries, even Latin America, where they are also commodity dependent, but it's more agriculture as well. And in contrast, labor-intensive manufacturing, which we're using auto and textiles as examples, are actually much less developed in South Africa than as exports than in other countries. In other words, part of the issue is the structure of production here tends to be biased towards heavy industry, and that means that even within formal employment in the formal sector, employment tends to be less than in other countries as well. And it's very hard to grow those industries in ways that create employment. So we would argue, these are the structural challenges that the master plans have to overcome if we're going to achieve that DTIC vision. In this context, the master plan project had 5 main innovations. Firstly, that we should have clear aims for industrial policy that should be explicit and that should help guide the master plan's process at the industry level. So if we see the master plan says industry level proposals, then they should be trying to achieve these aims, and those aims should be well defined overall. Secondly, the argument was we should focus on a few priority industries that would enable scaled up support. So the argument was we're modeling this on the auto industry process, where government has dedicated quite a lot of resources and a range of government agencies have provided support. And the question is, can we find other industries that could grow in ways that promote our aims and focus similar kinds of resourcing on those, rather than just sort of having modest investments in a bigger range of industries. The third issue was that there should be very close collaboration with industry stakeholders, especially established business and organized labor. And in many ways, because there's not a single document, people have different views of what this project was about, but I think the argument was having that kind of platform was in some ways more important than whatever the published document was. That the published document was like to help the stakeholders think about the issues, but that the key outcome of the master plans, many people think, was that you have this platform where stakeholders can engage on what's going on at industry level. On the argument, which is core to industrial policy, that every industry has its own unique constraints and opportunities. Fourth innovation was supposed to be that there's an evidence-based approach with ongoing evaluation and learning. So again, it doesn't matter so much what the initial document says. What's important is, are we able to adapt to changes in ways that still help us achieve our ultimate aims, rather than either saying, here's a fixed plan where we have to only review against that plan, but rather say, are we getting to the aims where we want to be, and can we work collectively to evaluate it based on the evidence, rather than ideology or wishful thinking. And then finally, again, prioritizing was supposed to lead to a significant scaling up of resourcing, and part of that resourcing was better alignment across the state. So a core issue for the reimagined industrial strategy was that industrial policy should not just be a DTIC project, it should be a national project. And that the master plans would help capture that by ensuring that all agencies, once you've defined your priority industries, you can ensure support from across the state that is consistent. So if you look at it in terms of a theory of change, just to be clear, government would set the main impacts and outcomes for industrial policy, then define a limited number of priority industries, which as a group could accelerate inclusive growth. And just to be clear, doesn't mean everyone would do the same things. The auto industry might be good for exports and technological advances, doesn't create a lot of jobs, whereas agriculture creates a lot of jobs. Some of them may be quite low level. So you need a package that achieves your national aims. For those industries, you set up a platform for engagement. The stakeholders agree on effective actions to ensure that the industry achieves national objectives. And they test the proposals against the evidence so we know that they're viable, but they also maintain oversight and adapt as required. And to that end, they set up governance structures, and then they allocate capacity and resources that are on a much larger scale than what we now have. And that, in turn, we get to the structural change we keep talking about that will ensure more rapid growth and a more inclusive economy. And then what happened in practice in terms of aims and prioritization, I have to say the reimagined industrial strategy, like I said, it didn't actually set down the aims. It said we need to clarify those aims. I don't believe there was a process to do that. I think the MTBPS, by the new medium-term development plan actually is a good step toward that end, but that was completed after this document was done. The aim is to balance, we would argue that whatever you do, there is a challenge where you have to balance support for established businesses in these industries against the need to have new opportunities, new clusters, new kinds of products, new kinds of businesses that will generate employment on a larger scale. So very often the dominant producers are unlikely to grow employment dramatically. And obviously they're not creating opportunities for small business very much, but we don't want them to go under either. So that balance is a tension that is very hard to manage. I will say that in 2023, they came up with some master plan guides, which I don't think have been implemented much, but actually the way they suggest the master plan should be developed is actually is using methodologies that were designed to help large individual businesses improve their outcomes, not to achieve national aims. And I think that is a problem because it focuses you on how do we do things like increase demand for existing businesses rather than how do we increase employment? What would that look like on the supply and the demand side? The priorities, again, was that we should have a limited number of industries that would enable scaled up resourcing, alignment across the state, but also manage lobbying. Because honestly, one of the things about the master plan process, which I'll come back to, is once you get rid of IPAP, which provided space for everybody, the only way industries feel loved and wanted is if they have a master plan. So everybody lobbies for a master plan, and every initiative is now called a master plan, whether or not it's actually an industry or a product, or whether or not it's large or small. So I think if government had a short list of its own, that would help deal with it. In practice, we started with a list of 13, which covered most of the economy. Of those, at the time of this thing was done, which was a few months ago, there were 6 published plans. There were 4 published that were not on the list. 3 of them were very small, which is sugar, poultry, and furniture. And there were 5 plans underway that were on the list, but all of them were small except for construction. And some of those, honestly, they've now been discussed for several years. And now we've also added cannabis and medical devices. So if you look at the graph, taken together, these industries accounted for about 8% of the GDP, and investment somewhat more in terms of employment. So they were relatively labor intensive as a group, although a lot of that is just agriculture. Very major in terms of exports and imports. So basically what you've got is the auto industry is a major importer, but also a major exporter. But the net exporters, again, are basically the commodity industries. So when you say the steel value chain, that's mostly iron ore, not steel, just to be clear. So that's really Kumba exporting iron ore, it's not steel. And then agriculture is the other major exports. Again, auto is a major exporter, also a major importer. And the other industries are not major exporters, although clothing is also a major importer. If you look at the strategies and measures, you know, one thing I would say about the master plans, they have not been great at articulating a strategic narrative in the sense of saying, this is what we're trying to do and this is why. So that when people implement it, they have a sense of, what are we actually trying to do here? What is the logic in terms of our diagnosis of the current situation? And again, part of the problem is that we have these twin imperatives that growth means we have to be more competitive. We can't just say we're going to, you know, put up tariffs or do localization irrespective of the cost or provide subsidies or whatever. We have to find a way to cut the cost of production. But we also have to generate opportunities on a mass scale. And those two things can be a contradiction, because if you increase productivity without increasing sales, you can end up with lower employment. So this stuff is difficult. If it was easy, we would have fixed it. In terms of the master plans, again, it's hard to figure out sometimes exactly what is the narrative. Business really consistently lobbied for protection, that is tariff protection, for local procurement by government, and for improved government services. They were really not interested in saying, how do we cut the prices of our suppliers in the value chain? And that was consistent. So they did reach some kind of agreement in sugar to hold down the price. The moment the agreement ended, the sugar producers increased the price by 14%, they said, but actually, according to the producer price index, the price went up 20%, which promptly led to an increase in imports. Yeah? But in other industries, like, so for instance, a key cost driver in poultry is soya. They really didn't want to have a fight with the soya farmers about the price of soya. In textiles, there's been an ongoing debate about what do we do about tariffs on textiles, which are an important input for clothing. There was agreement on woven textiles to cut the tariff, and that did lead to a boost in the clothing industry, but they're still, as far as I know, still negotiating what to do about knits, which is what you use in t-shirts and things. So again, and obviously iron ore and coal are still, you know, they're still linked to international prices. What that means is that our downstream industries are not getting the benefit of our natural resources in a consistent way, and that's always been a problem, well, since '94. Similarly, they weren't really interested in looking at technological change. So, you know, in poultry, everybody agrees we can't export our chickens because they're too small by international standards. Everybody else is closer to 2 kilos and ours are closer to 1 kilo. But to change that, you would have to redo all your cages and your feeding regimes and the kinds of feed you use. So it all becomes kind of complicated. Similarly with steel, do we want to support the mini mills or the integrated mills? And similarly with electric vehicles. So technological change is hard. The master plans, I think, for business, it's been very hard to be proactive about that. Much easier just to say, can't you give us more protection? Can't you do more localization? And can't you improve government services? In this context, I would say government really has tended to focus on increasing black ownership, so transformation, narrowly understood, but also on saying, okay, let's set targets that effectively reflect what business says it can offer. So we say to business, how much employment would you get if you actually do as much as you say, and that's our employment target. So it's, by definition, going to be incremental and not particularly transformative. In terms of the use of evidence, we did say, I mean, a core thing of this was we would have more evidence-based plans, but they actually didn't introduce new systems to enable the DTIC to commission or obtain or use evidence in different ways. So what we often see is people say we want expert opinions, but we don't really say how do we structure that into our own process so that it helps us understand the policy-making context better and monitor the implementation of our policies better. So there wasn't really, like I said, there wasn't really something which says, do we have evidence on the cost drivers or on the extent of employment creation or on small business? And we didn't really have much evidence that said, let's look at government and stakeholder proposals. Are they actually viable? Are they desirable? Are they leaving something out? But there was a big range. So in auto, we had the master plan is actually an input by experts on what are the broad economic imperatives for the industry to grow. And then at the other end of this scale, you've got the steel industry where the master plan is really a negotiations brainstorm, which has actually a whole bunch of clearly claims by different groups, some of which are contradictory. Yep. In terms of stakeholders, again, it was only formal business and labor, so a lot of people not in the room, specifically low-income consumers, small business, jobless people, municipalities were only represented by national departments, and national departments didn't have a way to get mandates from them. So they didn't evaluate, for instance, the impact of tariffs or local procurement on prices or on government services. They didn't say how to, government's role would have been to say, how do we open new opportunities for these people on a mass scale? That didn't really happen except in forestry where it wasn't actually implemented. And they did this funny thing where you can see there's problems with the mandating process where they actually agreed to say land reform would be based only on donations by the private sector and state land. So no expropriation was ruled out, even though it's in the Constitution. And I think my problem with that is it didn't really go through any processes because it was just an industry level agreement. But that's the kind of thing causes trouble down the line. And then alignment across the state, which was fundamental to this project. They didn't really set up any new systems or platforms to improve engagement, mandating dispute settlement or capacity across the state. So, right now, to this day, if two government departments disagree, those disagreements can go on for a decade. I mean, you go out of government, you come back, the same problem's still happening. Sometimes nobody cares about them anymore, but they haven't been resolved. And there wasn't any link to the budget or to state-owned companies' decisions about how they use their resources. So the master plans didn't propose large-scale increases in resourcing, although they do generally ask for improvements in infrastructure, but it's the way that was apparently supposed to work was the way it worked before, which is people say to the DTIC, this infrastructure is not working, and the DTIC tries to call ESCOM and see, can you fix it? Which ESCOM doesn't always respond favorably. But there's not anything new. Nothing changed in terms of how we get alignment across the state. And the average incentive remained at about 500 million per industry, except for auto, which is 30 billion. So if the idea was that auto is the model, and the model really is largely about how much money do we put in the current fiscal constraints, which you're about to hear about, I gather. It's going to be very hard to increase, but I would argue that if that was the model, that didn't work. I mean, some outcomes. Look, it's very hard to evaluate the overall impact because these things were adopted just before the COVID-19 crisis and everything that followed it. But even if they'd reached their targets, I have the figures here, but so for instance, the targets, the master plan industries as a group would have more than doubled growth, but because they're quite small, national growth would have gone up by only 0.2%. In terms of employment, they would again double growth from 1.1% a year to 2%. But national formal jobs growth would only increase by 0.1%. So the targets were not actually geared towards structural change. They were geared towards improving incremental outcomes, which is, again, necessary. But it's not the same as generating inclusive growth. And it would have almost no impact on there would be a marginal improvement in the employment ratio in terms of formal employment. So some examples, again, I mean, look, this stuff hit just with load shedding and the crises in Transnet. It doesn't seem to have led to a faster resolution of the load shedding crisis. More significantly, at least from what I can see, there wasn't really even much ability of the master plan platforms to say, like the executive committees and so on, to say, how can we help industries in our sector deal with load shedding better? They did see a slower increase in import intensity than other industries, but mostly because the commodity exports climbed because of high prices during this period. There were some, just to give some examples, the auto industry plan is predicated on the idea that we should reduce imports and increase supply for the local market so that we can get up to scale, because the argument is implicitly we're not going to increase exports that much, and that internationally industries have been unable to do the backward value chain, get the component suppliers going unless they have larger domestic markets. When they did the APDP, they decided that would require a massive change in the incentive system. They decided they didn't need that kind of disruption. But then they didn't go back and rework the master plan either. So it's not clear how that works. Chicken imports are down, but domestic production didn't actually increase as fast, and feed prices escalated. And the result is the consumption per person of chicken has fallen, and that is a staple food. So we basically put up tariffs in a way that cut local consumption of chicken as a staple because production couldn't keep up with it. Sugar imports, like I said, the price the decrease that was agreed to by local suppliers did reduce the sugar imports from Eswatini, because you remember tariffs don't apply to Eswatini because of SACU. But then when they raised their prices, those imports from Eswatini went back up again. So again, it's this issue of how do you deal with prices up the value chain? How much political capital is the state willing to put in to hold down those prices? Because industry will never ask for that. No? In steel, and this was before the current brouhaha, the debate over what should we do about the mini mills, that there is overcapacity in long steel between the mini mills and the integrated mill at Newcastle. And somebody probably has to close down a bit, and basically the way to close down the mini mills is to increase the price of scrap. The master plan actually said we should hold down the price of scrap, and that would benefit AMSA as well. That was clearly a misunderstanding somewhere. And you have similar issues around the rebate for textiles. Again, there's been progress on woven materials, but not on knits. So in other words, we're not seeing that kind of alignment across the state, or that kind of evidence-based and willingness to deal with the actual constraints, except for some effort to improve government services. And even that's been limited because of the lack of a new platform to achieve that. In terms of the impacts on socioeconomic groups, we looked at this in terms of key stakeholders. So the impact on formal businesses, the benefits was that they have a hotline to government. That's a good thing. We need better communication with business on the whole. They got a lot of import protection out of this, which they wanted, sometimes sustaining existing measures, sometimes adding new measures. They got some improvement in government services and financing, although probably limited. The costs are that they have to engage. This stuff takes time and energy. The EOC is at a very high level and takes, the executives have to go there. This is also a problem for our ministers. They have to support black-owned business. They agreed to some price restraint in sugar and poultry. They agreed to some funding for industry institutions and funds, and the retailers agreed to local procurement. So there were some commitments on their part, although I would argue they were fairly modest. I mean, the real risk is that their expectations were raised. Government was not always able to deliver because, on the one hand, there's a problem of alignment with other agencies, and we weren't clear about how to, for instance, how should ESCOM prioritize master plan demands over other demands? But also there are socio-political pressures that when you negotiate something mostly with established business, and then other people come along and say, okay, you said you wouldn't do land reform, but we want land reform. How do you deal with that as a government? Yeah? And I don't think this process helped with that very much. For small and emerging businesses, the benefits where you might get accelerated growth, you might get some targeted support. It's much harder for them to engage than for established business, so that's a bigger cost for them. So often if you have just one, the owner is the manager and they have to spend a day at NEDLAC, they can't. So they're often just not there. But the risk is that measures to favor established business, for instance, tariffs on inputs and provision of infrastructure, come at their cost if they're not able to engage, and defend their own interests. For unemployed and informal people, it's basically the same thing. Accelerated growth would help if the master plans did that, but there is a risk that we're actually catering so much to established business that we're not bringing about the structural change that would in fact lead to more job creation or more ownership on a significant scale. And in practice, there's nothing from the services, and there were limits on land reform. And that's where you might get some jobs. For working class consumers, again, they could benefit from growth, but I think the tariffs are a problem, that we don't have a way within the master plans of saying, how do we really rigorously say, what is the impact on consumers? How do we manage that? And then finally, for government departments and agencies, the benefits were, again, growth would give them more resources, and in some ways, if we say to producers, we will relieve you of competition in the short term, whether through localization or through tariffs, theoretically, they should be investing so they can become more competitive in the long term. The costs are that they have to put in huge amounts of capacity to manage the process. They have to deal with lobbying by established businesses, and they have to resource industry-level structures in some cases. So business put in some money, but the DTIC has had to put in funds as well. And they've had to pay for specific measures as agreed. And the real risk is that we raise expectations and then we don't deliver in some of these cases. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so some proposals would be, we need the targets for instance, for 2035, so that we have some way of measuring, are these kinds of programs helping us? I think, again, the medium-term development plan might be helpful in that regard. At least they've set very clear high-level priorities, as opposed to a long shopping list. That's always useful. I would argue we should be much more rigorous in selecting master plan industries if we're serious about saying these are priority industries. You know, it's now become a term for everything where we're saying we want this to be a priority of some kind. We call it a master plan. And I don't think that will get us to where we want to be, which is where we have really significant resourcing for structural change. That requires some sense of how do we prioritize these things. That requires a process we don't have. I would also argue we need to really think about how we use research. We need to be clear about what are the cost drivers. We need to be clear about what are the structural changes that could actually scale up employment and self-employment. And we need to have clear evidence-based proposals on that, and then also use evidence to test the claims from established business, which we've tended to have the research report, but then government hasn't always had capacity to say, if business tells us we need a 60% increase on chicken imports, does that make sense? What are the actual impacts? ITAC is supposed to do that, but they also often are not really able to do in-depth research to test that. In terms of government engagement, just to say, everybody says, dear colleagues from DTIC, you can correct me, but having the EOC at ministerial level is really painful because it means the minister ends up in endless meetings. And that it could be delegated to deputy ministers or DGs even, and then have maybe once a year jamboree if you must. It sounds trivial, but honestly, when things are over-centralized, it's very hard to function. That I think if we're serious about alignment, you need to say before you agree to something, you need some platform where you agree with the relevant government agencies before you sign off. And those things are never in place. So what tends to happen is we sign off saying we will try to get ESCOM to do this, or we will try to get Transnet to do that, and then we often can't. And it just puts pressure on everybody and leads to disappointed expectations. And then finally, I think there should be a requirement that master plans down the road should have to formally evaluate the impact of their proposals on consumers, on small business, and on municipalities before they reach any kind of agreement at industry level. Because in effect, government is there to represent those constituencies that are not in the room. And we need to make that more of a rigorous process. And then finally, right now, if you don't have a master plan, people feel very sort of abandoned if they don't have a master plan. So we need to say, what are we actually doing for industries that don't have a master plan, so that not everybody is lobbying to have a master plan? And what is the role of the sector desks? Some of you are here, but I think it's really unclear sometimes. Are you supposed to be advocates for your industries? Are you supposed to be making policy? Are you supposed to be doing unblocking work? Are you supposed to be monitoring and providing data for strategy? How does all of this fit together? And I think a bit more role clarity would make life a lot easier there. And then for industrial policy overall, I do think we have to be really clear. Industrial policy in South Africa is unique. We face unique challenges because of apartheid. We can't just act like we can just copy other countries. We need these long-term goals around inclusion and reconstruction if we want to stay on track. And that also means we kind of have to walk on two legs. That is to say, we need to say, what are the programs that will empower our people through, by producing new products, by having more ownership, more small businesses and self-employment, by providing finance, by having intermediaries that can support small business and new activities, and also the social economy and co-ops and government employment, all of those things. How do we create those opportunities? And at the same time, how do we help establish industries and producers? Because we can't just walk away from them. So how do we help them become more competitive rather than just always trying to protect them from competition and saying, how do we keep them, we're always trying to turn the clock back to some idyllic 1980s without the uprisings, as it were, which is not very realistic. And then finally, we have to think about what are the implications for the functioning of the state. We found it very hard to prioritize anything in this government because in a very divided society, it's easier just to add everybody's priorities. But that makes it very hard then to say, how do we look at structural change in the economy, which requires very large-scale, well-resourced programs to achieve some aims. Within the DTIC, it's also about how do we say if we prioritize industries, but somebody's been working on some particular thing all their lives, and we don't think that's now a priority. How do we manage that? People buy into their work. You know, you can't just say suddenly, oh, we think poultry maybe shouldn't be a master plan. Once it's there, it's there. So how do we deal with that kind of organizational change and development? And then finally, a really big issue, which has always been structural change of the kind we anticipate with industrial policy is risky. That means Treasury has tended to say we won't fund it because we don't want to take on the risks. What we need is to say, though, how do we come up with risk management systems so that we know we won't just throw the money away, but we are able to take risks to bring about the kinds of structural change we need on a larger scale. So, Kanaboha.
Thank you. Wow. You know, I was saying to the secretary of the committee, in fact, acting DDG, we should have had this meeting yesterday. After your presentation, then she comes in, because literally there is nothing to discuss today. I can barely tell you. And it's just so unfortunate, because the same observation, even before we could see your presentation, we could make them. And sometimes colleagues feel that we are harsher when we try to point out some of these relatives, but really, this is good work. I think it can help us to move forward. Let me just allow the colleagues. I'll also make my comments. Member Mdluli, Member Tigaba, and then we'll come in so that we can just make our own observation.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I echo your sentiments on the presentation, and I think it should have been done yesterday. But nonetheless, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I mean, I agree, you know, like with everything you're saying, and there's something to add on my side. But yeah, so I'll be keeping track, obviously, of all the activities and everything that's happening at TIPS, you know, so that we are informed as to our strategy. But so far, it seems good, and it seems like you have your ducks in a row. So that's just what I want to add and comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I hope I'm audible. This thing is complicated. Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Chair, you know, just on an aside, today I think is still a good day because it's allowed us to internalize yesterday's presentation so that we're able to engage appropriately with this. I think if we engaged with it yesterday, we might have jumped some of the issues that we had to raise yesterday. But just a few 7 questions, Chair. The first one is, what are the structural causes of low self-employment levels in South Africa? And which one would we prefer? Would we prefer higher employment or higher self-employment levels? Or is this, and what would be the ideal ratio between the two if the economy were functioning well? There is always talk of, you know, thriving economies, developing economies, relying heavily on small SMME family businesses, therefore people being employed in family enterprises. Now, it may sound a bit like an academic question, but we're looking at the structural transformation required in the South African economy. The second question, Chair, is you know, sometimes we talk about industrial policy and industrial strategy interchangeably. Are they the same thing? And if not, what are the differences? Is industrial policy part of the industrial strategy or industrial strategy part of the policy? But where do they differ and how are they similar? The third question, you've written, Comrade Niva, a lot about the minerals energy complex.
Honorable Gigaba.
Sorry.
Language.
Sorry. Apologies. You've written a lot about the minerals energy complex. I just would like to understand its impact on industrial policy. and strategy, and what, in the light of the presentation you've just made, do we need to do in order to deal? Because whenever we talk of industrial policy, we overlook the, I don't want to say the reactionary nature, but we overlook the negative impact of that sector on our ability as a country to industrialize away from the MEC-related sectors. And so what would you suggest we need to do in the context of industrial policy and tips? The next question relates to the final issue you raised about the role of government, because it seems it's difficult to fund master plans in the context of protracted fiscal austerity. We've been on fiscal austerity for the longest of time. It doesn't seem that we are likely to get out of it. Now, what do we need to do? Because the role of government, I mean, if government must implement a sustainable industrial, then there must be bold government, there must be better coordination, and we seem to be having a more bureaucratized government coordination, where every department pursues its own mandate, and departments end up trampling on one another. But you also need consistency in terms of the timelines, the milestones to be achieved, all of which we seem to lack. Every 5 years, new priorities, or at least every 10 years, new priorities are established, you then change, you move away from the previous priorities, many of which you might not have even realized. The final question, Chair, before my 3 minutes is over, is the social compacts. Oh, but the final question. The social compact, and I hope I'm not moving too fast. Yes. Two issues here. One is, do labor unions as a sector in this work, do they raise the issue of the emphasis on job creation, on job growth? Because it would seem that we are more focused on business objectives, the objectives of the capitalist class. Do labor unions raise emphasis on jobs growth, on the quality of the jobs, the sustainability of the jobs created on behalf of their members? And in the context of the low employment rate in the country, which means that unions represent, if we narrow down who they represent the employed, who are a minority. So how are we able, or how are the interests of the broader working class in the country represented in terms of all the sectors that comprise the working sectors of this sector? Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Imran.
Well, thank you, Chair. The Chair, let me welcome the presentation by the Honorable Doctor. Very insightful and very timely as well, as we set forth to charter a way for our country to create employment and to address the issues of poverty. Chairperson, I only have one single question. The Doctor has alluded to it, and that is the 4IR. And my concern is with regards to the evolution and the fast forwarding of artificial intelligence, the digitization of the economy, and the emergence of the digital economy. I noted, and I would like to get the Honorable Doctor's reflection on that, and how does it map out the industrialization of our country, and particularly how does it address the issues of insecurity amongst the working class people? Because on one end we face this worldwide, and particularly in South Africa, we are pushing for digitization, but at the back end of it is the concern of insecurity, of job security, and what will be the impact of that? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, honorable members. So maybe the question on my part, if maybe you can just help us as a committee, take us into confidence. Why was IPEP and all its iteration replaced when seemingly there was no plan in place? And I'm saying this at the back of the fact that the department has admitted that currently there is no industrial strategy in South Africa, and we've made a point as a committee that having listened to the master plans, we were of the view that the country needs to urgently conclude on the industrial strategy policy, and then which these master plans should be subordinated to the industrial policy, and at the core, what must underpin this, we flagged issues of transformation precisely because of the issues that you've raised, that the apartheid South Africa gave us a different scenario. So when we talk industrialization, we cannot just talk about it outside of the issues of transformation that are critical in South Africa, given the fact that we've come from the horrible past. The second point is that we've raised a very serious discomfort, not industry attack on auto and steel. Discomfort, because we look at the skew and we know that the Department of Incentives are still coming. We've said to them, it would appear that the whole budget of DTI, 5.1 billion goes to incentives, but of the chunk of that, of our view, and I think this research has proven that we're actually correct, is going to the auto sector. But even the observation we made yesterday is that, can someone explain to us why we've not been able to produce our own South African car? Even the lowest level of a car, just a car that can move on the street, is produced by ourselves. And the observation of what is happening in the steel from the inception, when ISCO was formed in the 1920s, 1929, when it was privatized in 1989 and subsequently sold in 2002. A case exists in South Africa, and what we're picking up from the colleagues yesterday is that a case exists for a thriving steel industry, given the fact that if we are to proceed with our project of infrastructure build program, steel is a critical component that cannot be ignored. And we believe that what proper work or justice has been done in terms of looking at the steel sector. Now, the other critical issue that we observed yesterday is that we've asked the department, we said the apartheid economy was anchored on agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. And then support industries were built, and we have all these SOEs that were supporting those for rail, freight, energy, transmission, and ports, and all those things. Those things have collapsed. And we've not had, and I think also even in your presentation here, it's clear, we've not been able to say, what do we do if we are marching ahead to industrialize South Africa? We've not been able to say, how to ensure that these support industries, these SOEs, are not in the current shape they are in, or they are not worse off, or they are not privatized, in order for them to provide this national service that is required. And the next question was that, having observed that apartheid anchored our economy on three sectors, as I mentioned, the question that we're asking now, what is our sunrise industry? As you say, that everybody now is jumping around, wants a master plan for this reason, that reason, lobbying, and. What is it that we can say, this is what is going to anchor the industrial policy of South Africa? You know, not undermining all other industries that are there, so that we can then begin to then say, how do we deploy necessary resources in that sunrise industry that is being identified? And I see you say in the presentation that, look, mining, you know, literally saying that mining is in sharp decline, and we've made that observation yesterday. So we need to have this kind of conversation that for us to have economic growth in South Africa, these are 2, 3, not these 101 things. Master plans are fine, but what are these 2, 3 things that, if we do and do them well, they will result in large-scale job opportunities for the masses of our people, because that is what is lacking. I think those are the issues. And then, obviously, I think having read this work last night after our meeting, I'm quite excited, and this is probably is an unrelated question, the extent to which tips can help the portfolio committee to, because we are now moving into the era where the department is going to be presenting a new APP. And we've been very clear in terms of what we would like to see in terms of articulation. Can TIPS as an institution or entity assist us to put up a framework, firstly, to ensure that we have measurable targets that are realistic, that we can trace whether or not they could be achieved, because we have had lots of things. We are disagreeing with numbers. You know, department comes and say, we've created 693,000 jobs. We say, where? You know, they say we've supported this. So we're not agreeing about what is what here. So, but we do need, in our view, and we attempted with our researcher here, Nogwanda, on trying to put a framework in which we can hold each other accountable, so that no one feels that we're harsh, we're unrealistic, we're asking things we shouldn't be asking, because our role here as a portfolio committee is to hold the department accountable. And I'm asking this obviously as a side issue, the extent to which, because what I'm reading here is an objective analysis of the situation, and I'm saying, yesterday we might not have had evidence, but just reading what was given to us, we came to the same conclusion about the range of issues that we are raising in as far as this master plan are concerned. And the last point, I've asked about that. Obviously, I think the other issue I was raising is just our own methodology, so that we can of ensuring that we can hold the department accountable will become critical. And I'll be interested to, lastly, to hear why you are of the view that the mineral energy complex is not an area or site of struggle that we must look at as we pursue to look at what is our sunrise industries, given the fact that we have more than 56 minerals in South Africa, and all of them, you know, we've really not really, you know, there's still a long way to go. So I would like to hear your comment with regards to that, and then over to you, and then we'll come back maybe with the second round from other members. Welcome, member Olga Siate. Over to you.
Yeah, so a lot of questions. I'll do my best. And I will end up combining some of them. So in terms of low self-employment, I think the issue is we know what started it. I mean, can we talk about Hegelian dialectics? You know, we know what produced it, but what is the reproduction? Yeah, so the structural cause was apartheid. Just you know, people don't, compared to other developing countries, you don't have people have their own productive assets. They don't have families that they could learn from in most cases. They don't have suppliers and financing and market systems in place to build on. So because of what happened under apartheid, people have to start all over from fresh if they want to open a business. Yeah? And I think that's very hard. I mean, I couldn't open a business. I come from a family of academics, and I wouldn't know where to start. So it has a lot to do with that. I think that just that inheritance in terms of both material and just cultural and social and competencies is an issue. And so the question for the state is, what should government do? And I do think there is an issue that self-employment is riskier. That does mean that if you get it right, you can do much better than if you have a wage job, but it also means we're forcing individuals to take on a lot of risk, you know, and often without the resources that they would need to make that easier, you know. So, I mean, I always cringe when people say, what about youth entrepreneurs? It's like, there's a reason most entrepreneurs are older. You need to have the networks, you need the assets, you need the security in your life and the competency and the experience to succeed, and to push people into it without that is risky. So I do think there's a problem, and it's not that you could just say, I think we should have more small business, but how much of the employment problem should be done through small business, how much through employment schemes, how much through public sector schemes and the social economy and subsidized projects, and just big business expanding in labor-intensive areas. You know, I think industrial policy is an art, not a science. So what you have to end up saying is, look, let's look at all the possibilities and see what works. You know, you can't just determine that in advance. But I don't think it's realistic to say everybody who's now unemployed to just become self-employed, right? Unless we're going to give them huge amounts of support. No? So I would argue the real problem is, how do we deal with joblessness, not what is our long-term objective, if you see what I mean. And the issue there is we need to grow both employment and self-employment. But, you know, how to do that, that's the challenge. I do think that what comes up for me from the master plan story is we need to focus more on saying, where can we grow output? And where can we grow employment? And what is the role of the state, perhaps, in subsidizing some of that because of the social benefits of employment? And I think, to come back to something you said before, that part of the problem there does become, to be blunt, resourcing, but there's also a trade-off with social grants. You know, that given limited resources, it's much less risky for Treasury to say, we'll put the money to social grants, we know who gets it, people get it. There is many big social benefits from social grants. But that does squeeze the rest of the budget in some ways. And unless we can tap into other off-budget sources of funding, there is a trade-off there that is very hard to manage. Yeah? And honestly, if I were in Treasury, I'd probably be doing social grants. But I think we all agree that as a long-term solution, socially as well as economically, that's less desirable. But, yeah? Structural change is hard. So I'll come back to that. I do think that, look, the link between strategy and policy is really what this is about, that we have industry-level policies. We don't have a clear strategy, and that's a problem. Part of the reason we don't have a clear strategy is that we are dealing with a very deeply divided society. You know, we have a political democracy that is one of the most unequal in terms of the economy in the world, and I think that makes it extremely hard to come up with agreements on anything. So we tend to fudge these things, you know. And it's really hard to stand up to big established business, and yet, you know, at the end of the day, you need to get the votes, theoretically. So I think these balances become extremely hard. Yeah? And I think that is why there's a lot of people do research saying that the more integrated and equitable society, the faster it tends to grow, and that deeply unequal societies tend to grow more slowly. And one of the main reasons is just contestation over ownership and policy. So, which is a way of saying it's easy to talk about the need for priorities as long as they're my priorities. Yeah? Yeah, sorry, this thing just did something funny. Yeah, so how do we feel about the mineral energy complex? I always figure it's kind of like an abusive party. You know, when the prices are high, they're incredibly charming and we love them and things do really well, like they did in the 2010s. You know, and they really saved us in the aftermath. Very high prices, export prices really helped in the aftermath of the COVID downturn. But when prices are low, then we keep saying that's when we talk seriously about reconstruction, but we also keep thinking maybe prices will go up again. So let's not reconstruct too far so that if prices go up, we can take advantage. So I think the real thing is we can't just wish it away. No? I think it's more about saying we do have to diversify away from mining. Where can we diversify into? What makes sense? What can we do? We can't just copy Asia and go into manufacturing probably because we are latecomers. And that has a lot of implications, but we could at least say more clearly, you know, and this is where your thing about targets comes up. Can we benchmark to see, are we in fact diversifying? What would diversification look like in terms of those targets? So that we're not so dependent on mining exports more than other countries, because it does also limit employment creation because it is capital intensive. So to me, it's the issue more of what kind of industries can create employment or self-employment, and then what are realistic targets to get there, and how do we measure whether we're getting there, and then change policies if we're not getting there. Yeah? And I do think the thing is about the MEC also is it is so deeply, I mean, I prefer to think of it as the coal value chain, because that's really what we're talking about. It was the production of coal for energy that made the mines possible, made Transnet possible, all of that. That stuff is also deeply ingrained in all of our decision-making systems across the state. And so part of the question is that closing off opportunities? And if it is, how do we change it? And that's because we have to sustain mining, but are there things we could do that would help in moving beyond it as well? Without, you know, it's like you don't, you know, when you grow up, you don't give up on your parents, but you don't stay, you know, you don't have to live in their basement for the rest of your life either. No? And in that context, fiscal austerity, I think we need to be obviously more creative about off-budget resources. You know, one of the things we did during COVID, which was using the UIF funds, really, to me, pointed to what we could do. And we always talk about it, but we never get there, you know. I also think we need to be really careful about, I mean, Treasury, you know this, what Treasury always says is we will do these big cross-cutting cuts in. So we'll hold down remuneration, and we'll hold down social grants, and then it's politically impossible, and then we bust the budget, and then they cut things slightly at random. So if we're serious, we need that process of genuinely engaging about reprioritization. What would that look like? And not just do things like say, well, we'll just build in an increase that we know we will never be able to stick to for political reasons. And that's that contradiction between the economy and politics again. Yeah, so I think that part of the problem with the budget is that we have these unrealistic budgets because we say we'll do things that are politically not viable, and then we can't stick to it, and then the budget looks, you know, gets broken, and then we have even less targeted approach. I do think, personally, my feeling is we're being overly restrictive on fiscal and monetary policy generally, but that in itself isn't going to solve the problem. If we don't do the structural change, we could really end up with, you know, more inflation, slower growth, all of those issues. So that's, you know, not the core of the problem. In terms of social, look, the unions always raise employment creation, but I don't think it's fair. And you know, I used to work for them. You can't expect the unions to deal with these trouble, you know, to represent the rest of society. They don't have capacity. If we gave them resources, they could. But it is the role of the democratic state to represent people who otherwise won't have voice. And I think that's a problem because it puts a huge burden on the mandating process and on officials who are being asked to think about innovative solutions in a way that is very difficult. And I think the systems that we inherited and that we still have are not set up to enable them to do that. And I will say, this is why TIPS was, you know, every country that's had a successful industrial policy has had some kind of think tank to help, because it's very hard when you're actually trying to implement a policy and keep an eye on a sector and engage with stakeholders to actually come up with innovative ideas. But the political leadership has to say, what is the mandate? And how do we resource the mandate? No? But we don't have systems in place that are good at dealing with that. And that we end up saying that, and I've been on both sides of this, there is nothing more annoying than to walk into a job summit and the government guys are saying, well, what can you give us as labor? And it's like, what can we give you? What do you want? You know, like, what can we give you on infrastructure? It's your infrastructure. What do you want us to give you? And it's very unclear often. And what the people often want from labor is less militants, but we don't have the guts to say that. Yeah, but we know that the wages here are not lower than in other countries, so that doesn't work. And given very unequal societies, you're not going to get to a low wage strategy. And we want actually less workplace conflict, which makes sense, but we don't have the guts to say that either. And also anyways, and you need to change middle management to get to a less conflict-ridden society. And we want the pension funds, but we never quite want to articulate that either. So government needs to say, what do we want more clearly? And I think to say, why doesn't labor say more? Well, they try, but they really, this is why you have that thing, labor opens the door and business walks in. Because labor often doesn't have capacity to come up with specific proposals, and I don't really think it's their job. No? So who represents the broader working class? Should be the democratic government, surely. I mean, that's why we have democracy. No? Yeah, and what can we do? Look, in terms of then the role of tips, honestly, there's a resourcing issue that my boss would tell you. I mean, Saul Levine, who's the chief executive director, has to keep an eye on the money, and he would say, we would love to volunteer for more things, but we have limited resources. Having said that, I think they really think something like tips can help with is a lot of the numbers you're getting are outputs and outcomes, but you want to look at the impacts, and it's that de-link that is hard. Because the de-link happens in two ways. Firstly, the outputs can be good, but you're losing jobs someplace else. And how do you see that? Well, I do think over the longer run, as opposed to a quarterly report, if employment's not going up, then you can say it doesn't matter what the outputs are, this policy is not working. And that's where, tips can help by looking at some of those impact figures. But something like if they say we are supporting 200,000 jobs in an industry, and by supporting means there are 200,000 people involved in this job which has a master plan, then we're getting into definition of what is support. You all have to say what you want to hear from them. That might be, what does that actually mean? Okay. In terms of technological change, and I think that also applies with the MEC, part of the problem is this. Other countries don't have our unemployment problem. They have people who are employed in low productivity self-employment. That is, they're on subsistence farms. They have little retail shops. They have small, if you've been to places like India, you have the small, these very small shops producing things in a fairly primitive way. Here we have just flat out unemployment. And what that means is we need to come up with growth that generates employment opportunities for people to engage with the economy, engage with society, and earn some kind of income that may not be cutting edge by anybody's standards, because they're going from producing nothing to producing something. Whereas other countries, they're moving out of, say, agriculture into manufacturing or services, and there's an increase in productivity. And what that means to me is this, that we can't just chase higher productivity across the board, and yet we need some higher productivity sectors, and we need to think about how that works. And it's not obvious, no? The one thing I would say is a lot of the displacement of labor anticipated from things like AI and robotics and the fourth IR generally. And by the way, you should talk to Saul Levine about this because he did the study on it, not me. But it's much more relevant to the global north, where wages are much higher. And then we just adopt the same technology despite our wage levels. And I think that's something we need to think about, because really companies, international companies, have two strategies when it comes to dealing with workers' wages. They either try and mechanize them out of existence, or they move to the global south. No? And that's still happening. And the real problem is then we just copy their technologies. So what I would argue is, I think that there's going to be a lot less displacement of labor in South Africa than people talk about in other parts of the world, and that there are areas where we have real strengths, like in software, that we could build on. But the trouble is, reflecting the inequalities in education, that could deepen inequalities if we don't sort out the digital gap. I mean, that would be my simple answer. And that we need to think about the just transition issues as well, obviously. Yeah? But the bigger issue is to say, how do we grow employment in often not very technologically advanced areas that will add value for society, give people an income, might require some subsidies, might not require subsidies, but would enable people to be part of society and generate some income for themselves, even if it has to be supplemented. Yeah? As well as how do we do things to grow competitiveness in the higher end of our industries. And, you know, those things can be contradictory and we have to manage that. Why was IPAP replaced by Masterplans? Because people felt that we needed to have a few industries and make them work. No? And IPAP was seen as a collection of industry strategies, and I think people didn't think about the fact that it also provided a cross-cutting framework, even if it wasn't always that well articulated as a cross-cutting framework. And so I think the effort was more to say we need to enforce priorities, and I think they didn't think about what they were losing in the process. And they certainly didn't think about what happens to sector strategies for industries that are not priorities, where we might still want some kind of sector-level responses. So I think that was genuinely people not thinking, and I think introducing, and this is where I think the medium-term plan might help, is that it gives a framework for thinking about what is your cross-cutting strategy as opposed to just your industry-level policies. And again, I think we really need to be clear about what are we offering to industries that don't have a master plan. I'm sorry, you asked a lot of questions. Now I feel like I'm just droning on here, sorry. Okay. And then, look, the thing about, look, most of the incentives for auto are from the tax policy. The tax breaks they get from the tariffs. So, you know, it's that thing where the Treasury comes up with that figure, adding up everything, but most of it is that they have reduced tariffs on imports of autos as long as they export. And that's where the master plan was actually originally saying we have to change that, because what it means is that the domestic market, particularly for smaller cars, is met by imports. And we have almost a balance of trade most years, very slight export surplus, but it's pretty small, like the net balance is small. And that they were saying we have to find a way to protect the domestic market for local producers, but that was never implemented. So to get to 1 million cars, you probably do need to do something about the domestic market, and if we're not prepared to do that, I would argue we need to say, okay, we'll have a small, very high quality, world-class assembly industry for cars. What do we get out of it? How do we maximize the benefits? Rather than trying to, you know, it's like Ben Fine used to say, you can't criticize a horse for not being a unicorn, you know, so it is what it is. In terms of a local car, I think this is the point. There's very little justification for building a car from scratch in South Africa or having our own model. We need to say, what are the personal transport needs that we have in South Africa that are unique? How do we meet them? And that might give us a platform for going to other countries that also need those. And this is the Brazilian model. I mean, I don't know if you know about Embraer, but the argument was they needed short-haul jets. Nobody was producing them. They, of course, have 330 million people, so it's a much bigger market. But they said, let's focus on our needs, and it turns out a lot of other people found that a useful thing, and nobody else was producing it. Whereas if we're just producing a car like India could produce, then we probably, starting from scratch with a much smaller scale market, will not be able to compete. And if you want my personal opinion, I think we should be looking at e-bikes and motorcycles, because there is a problem that people don't have their own personal transport, you know, and they can't afford a car, you know, and there's, besides the whole issues around pollution and so on. No? But if we produce, you know, if we really said we're going to produce motorcycles for all of Africa, so we all turn into, if you've been in Vietnam, you can't cross the street. This is not a thing you see, because everybody has a moped, and crossing the street is hell, right? If we were going to do that across Africa, it really improves people's living standards. They're relatively cheap, and it makes a big difference for people's lives, you know? Instead of trying to produce a car where we probably can't come up with something that is uniquely meeting our needs. No? But I do think we need to be clear about, that's what I'm saying. We need to say, what do we want from the auto industry that is actually viable if we're not going to protect the domestic market the way the master plan originally proposed. And then, sorry, can I just say something about steel, because we've just been doing a lot of work on steel. Look, I would argue this is the point. Our steel industry, historically, the MEC, was competitive because we held down the price of iron ore and coal to the domestic steel producers, and they held down the price of steel to people downstream. The logic behind the steel industry in South Africa is we have very small deposits of extremely high-quality iron ore, and we've got some decent coal, and that's the basis for the steel industry. Once we said that those guys could charge market-related prices for iron ore and coal, it's really hard to justify an integrated mill. No? And so that's why you get this fight. So instead of saying, let's raise the price of scrap and put the mini mills out of business, we should be saying, how do we bring down the price of other inputs? Because that's how we capture those benefits for the country. You know, but then you also have to make sure ArcelorMittal doesn't just raise its prices for the downstream. And we've never been willing to do that, and that's always, you know, and ArcelorMittal has downsized by 60% since it was taken over by AMSA, and I think that right there tells you this is a longer term crisis, and you're not going to do it by just shutting down the mini mills. It's not going to save it. No? Sorry, I probably missed a whole lot of other things, but they were very interesting questions. There were a lot of them.
We'll try to be very brief because other members must leave at least by 12, but I think this has been a fruitful engagement. So given the fact that this assessment has probably been read by the DTI officials and authorities, and have you made some proposals? What are they considering? Are they considering, given the current master plans as they are, so that we can just get a sense whether or not there is greater appreciation of the work that is being done to analyze this work? I'll also allow other members maybe to just have some few follow-up questions, then we can conclude. Member Kigaba and Member Mdluli.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Makhetla, for very extensive responses. Just shouldn't industrialization be an integrated master plan so that we know? I mean, all other things become sub-master plans, but feeding into a big master plan that we're implementing, which involves all of government, where we're able to resolve conflicts, contradictions between departments, deal with issues of financing. Because it would seem all countries which have developed, the experience of your East Asian countries, even countries such as France, the United States itself, they were able to harness finance capital towards areas of strategic development for them to achieve the levels of development. Others either by directly controlling finance, and others by having very strategic relationships with the financial services, such that, however, government leadership was evident, such as in Japan and other areas where they would direct finance. Obviously, all developing countries or developmental states are ultimately loosened up. But for quite a long time, they had a single vision, a consistent master plan, long-term implementation of that developmental master plan, and therefore, priorities didn't change now and then. Everybody knew these are the milestones, these are the targets. So that's my follow-up question. The second one, you argue that the MEC is effectively a coal value chain. True, South African economy is highly energy intensive, and it's relied. One of the interesting things with regard to the origins of Eskom, the South African Railways and ISCO, was that they served as members of the family. Eskom relied, but through all of them, there was this role of the coal mining sector, because Eskom procured cheap coal to produce cheap electricity to supply to railways and ISCO. ISCO supplied cheap steel to Eskom and Transnet supplied cheap railways for coal as well as for steel. Now, and that helped to propel industrialization in South Africa. I'm just limiting it to these three sectors, but at the center of which was the coal industry. Now, is the thinking about whether we can use renewable energy to begin this diversification away from the coal sector? And to what extent really? Or are we just simply being ambitious? Because if you look at it, ultimately you're still going to need baseload electricity generation. And since we're not building a nuclear power station,
Or maybe we are.
or maybe we are. Well, I hope if we are, then we get informed. But at the present moment, we're not. The procurement has been stopped. And so are we, which means that soon we're going to run into an electricity crisis when the existing coal-fired power stations reach age and renewables really depend on the availability of those natural sources like sun and wind. So how or in what areas, I hear you talking about electric bikes, which would be interesting for many of us who have to brave traffic coming here and arrive late for committee meetings. But, so I wanted to ask whether you thought the electric vehicle is an overly ambitious project. Because quite frankly, it's going to take us maybe another century to eventually diversify away from the mining sector, but it could take less depending on what projects we come up with that assist us in that regard. The final issue is not really a question. It's just the you know, to say a comment about the importance of government leadership, state leadership. And I think you've said a mouthful about it, and I think our questions are also emphasizing the importance of state leadership to drive industrialization, because in the absence of that, the country implements an ad hoc industrial plan that is not going to have any milestones. Every sector represents their own interests, but nobody is able to harness the common interests of all. And given that business has got capital, and capital is quite wayward, to quote Wu Cummings. It's quite wayward in terms of investing in new sectors and being told where to invest. I think, you know, even though you may have a strong government, but if it cannot maintain embedded autonomy with the private sector, then that state is not going to be able to direct development in any way that's going to be meaningful and sustainable for the country. Thank you.
Madam Mdluli?
Thank you, Chair. Well, mine isn't a question as well, but just to follow up, just a comment as before. You did raise that you suggest that we find ways to work with TIPS, and I do agree. We do need to find a way to see how we can work together, because they raised some valid points, and when I was listening to the doc, speaking and answering the questions, it felt like he was preaching. So to some extent, I do agree with her on a lot of things that she raised and said. So if we can find a way on how we can work together, that would be very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Imran?
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, I want to simplify my contribution and bring it down to a grassroots level and try to hone in how this discussion here can address one of our apex priorities, and that is reducing unemployment and reducing poverty. Chairperson, about 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity, I think in this room here, of attending a round table. It was International Day for the Alleviation of Poverty. And I was one of the members from my party that was present here, and I took part in it. And I shared with the House, my interest is in how can we focus, because I'm hearing the conversation of industrialization, etc., and with the utmost of respect, I submit to Honorable Chairperson. While this has a long-term perspective, the reality is the bulk of our South African people are struggling. We have challenges. And how do we bring this conversation in such a way that it truly impacts on the ground? Not in 20 years' time, but I think in a sooner time frame. So that's where I'm trying to just try and steer my thinking and perhaps share my reflections. And in that, I shared with the team, an international model was shared about poverty index. And I found that we could not precisely understand or measure the level of poverty in South Africa. And I managed to do some research. And I found that since 2019 to 2024, our poverty, our food security has dropped by almost 30%. Chairperson, we've heard, and I see in the proposal made by the Honorable Doctor, is that reduce mining dependence. And one area that we are enriched with as South Africa is vast amounts of land, and agriculture has always been an area of strength. And that all these industries that you had alluded to, the rail, the ports, etc., was all built to that. And I think, Chairperson, that is and also this ties in with my concern about AI and digitization. How do we get our people to use their hands and really earn a living and feed themselves? So I would like to ask the Honorable Doctor, how can we resurrect agriculture as a mainstream economy, and more so as a means of creating employment and as a means of addressing the issues of food security? Because food insecurity, the level of food insecurity, Honorable Chairperson, has dropped. Food insecurity has increased by 33%, and it's projected to increase even further. And I think it's a concern that we as South Africans and are sitting in this portfolio committee should be mindful of. So I think to bring it to close is, how can we utilize and resurrect agriculture to address issues of unemployment, to mitigate the risks of emerging digital economy, of AI, and of course provide food to our people? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much. I think this will be the last round of questions from the committee. I think one of the things I tried to raise is that I think that this thing of reneging from land expropriation has got a direct effect in some of the issues that you are raising, because there are no new players in the sector. And this is one of the effects, but also the other effect is much more on other imperatives for the country. And so when this call is being made, it's not just a silly call to take away from Peter to pay Paul. We have to expand the basket. So we should not renege on land expropriation. It's one area that we'll have to really, as a portfolio committee, engage sister portfolio committees to deliberate about this issue, so that we can bring about transformation in South Africa. But let me allow a good doctor to make a concluding remarks. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. So before you talk, I think the another talk they wanted to comment. Let me give him a chance to do so. DTIC.
Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity. As the department, we note the contribution made by TIPS. Just to also add that we are using TIPS as the department to assist in the management of the implementation of the master plan. So TIPS is the project manager for, I think it's the steel master plan, clothing, there's sugar as well. So because there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done, you know, with other social partners. So TIPS does play a role in there, and some of the challenges they come through the reporting. We do deal with those challenges. So from an administrative point of view, we acknowledge some of the challenges raised, and we commit ourselves as a department to resolving them. But through you, Chair, again, besides the administrative challenges, there are structural economic challenges that will require choices to be made. And I think it's slide number 5, if Dr. Neva can fly that slide, because for me, that is key in resolving some of the challenges we have as the country, where I think she indicates the trends in goods which are exported and imported. I think the last two bars there, because that's the key. If you look at the imports, you'll see that again I think it's the steel or it's the other agriculture. You have the autos, but it's the autos which is big when it comes to imports, and steel, yes. So basically, what we discussed yesterday, the issue around, the major challenges is steel, it's autos. Now, how do we resolve the two? In terms of the support measures and the economic policy instruments that are key in driving the trends. But also what Dr. Makhetla is raising is that moving forward, we still have to make some policy choices on how do you resolve the reliance on mineral resources, because almost about 60% of our exports are still mineral based. And if we don't process them, we continue the challenge of not creating jobs in the value chain. All right, so that's another issue that we need to have been talking about that. But if you are to make an impact on the jobs, we'll have to tackle that challenge, because we just export that. So structurally, we'll have to then agree on, as a country, on how do we embrace new sectors which are creating jobs, all right, and how do we migrate from the reliance on minerals to sectors which are less on that but are growing, and we are able to produce goods and services which have a global demand, because that's a structural challenge we have in the country. So I also like what the good doctor has been able to raise here about the rents that we have in the economy, because what we are being told is that, when we talk about public procurement, is that middlemen are raising the price premiums. And what this slide is indicating is that upstreams, we are not dealing with the issue of price premiums and the rents which are being accrued by few people in the economy, because the structure and the economy is highly concentrated. So we also need to use policy instruments strategically to deal with the structural ownership, but also the prices which are accruing to a few people, which do not necessarily make the economy competitive. So from an institutional point of view, what is also becoming clear is that, you know, the implementation of industrial policy and some of the master plans, it's also based on the performance of other government agencies. How do we use competition policy in some of the sectors to open up competition and loosen prices? How do we drive transformation so that we create opportunities in the value chain? So those are the issues that, you know, as we drive transformation in the economy and implement the master plan, we'll have to deal with. And lastly, Chair, to indicate that there's other work that the department is doing besides the master plans, and maybe through the APP that will come up through, and just an indication as to what we are doing in supporting the economy. And yeah, we agree that we should not lose the focus on the economic structural challenges which we must resolve. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Over to you, good doctor.
Yeah, and I think there's also there's work on an industrial policy framework, which I think is precisely because there's a recognition that I think we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater with IPAP. And I think it would be useful, you might also want to engage on the drafts on that they've been working on early on rather than just waiting for the final document. I mean, I do think the new master plans are really more about saying what are some priority projects as opposed to seeing it as replacing industrial policy as originally anticipated. I do think a critical question is, for whatever you do, is that how do you make this a whole of government project is easier said than done, given the inherited structures, but also given that there's just huge differences in, you know, in an unequal society, just reaching agreement about anything, as you know, is very hard. And I think just if one could say what you were saying, what are the long-term aims that we can measure progress against? And that might mean then changing specific policies. That would be useful, but also what are the institutional structures that could ensure that alignment? What's the role of the presidency and treasury? What's the role of the DTIC? What's the role of the cluster? I think if we're serious about alignment, those things have to be somewhat restructured. Oh gosh, remember the super ministry? Anyways, yeah. And it does require more resourcing than we have, because when you engage, you need resources, and we tend to ignore that. The other thing I think would be really helpful, which comes up with some of what you're saying about Asia, is a more consistent approach towards business with more clear mandates would be really helpful. That I think what happens is we're not really clear what we want from established business, so we tend to either give them whatever they want or tell them how much we hate them. And, you know, it makes them crazy. And I think that if we were just really clear, this is what we want, and we will do everything we can to cut your costs except for what we want. But then we expect you to invest in what we want and to accept, for instance, the costs of transformation. That's something we're not going to walk away from. But we will, by God, make sure ESCOM works in return. You know, that if we could get those trade-offs better, it would be better. Yeah. And I think that applies to what you said about, do we want an integrated mass? Look, we need a clear industrial strategy that is implemented by well-defined policies, whatever you want to call it. And I think, again, with IPAP, we kind of threw out some of the strengths we had there, but I think people are trying to resurrect them. The one thing I'd like to say about Asia is that, you know, the thing about Asia was they were just in a really different context. Firstly, they were competing with the global north. So our wages are actually now about the same as China, right? The difference is they were competing with the US and we're competing with China. No? So it was easier for them to just grow back then. Now we're competing with them, it's much harder. So we can't just copy it. But also they were agricultural societies rather than societies where you had mass joblessness. So they could afford to say to people, stay on the farm, and when there's a job, you can take it. Whereas we're under much more pressure just to create jobs quickly. And thirdly, they were in the middle of the Cold War, which meant there was lots and lots of American military spending all over the region. And that certainly helped. And that also means you've got regional infrastructure built in ways that we don't. So if we need undersea cables or, you know, ports or whatever, it's all us. We can't look to, like, China could look to Japan and South Korea. South Korea could look to Japan. Those things make a huge difference as well. So I'm just saying, I think we really need to think about our possibilities are limited and different. And then the one thing about new energy, no, I think it's a huge advantage for us that we have cheap renewable energy. And it's an advantage in two ways. Firstly, cheaper electricity in the long run, particularly as people force coal to internalize the cost of pollution. But secondly, 20% of our imports are liquid fuel. You know, so from a just end state comparison, we would be doing much better if we could shift to energy, renewable energy. The baseload thing to me is not such a big issue because really what we're saying is we've always had an incredibly centralized electricity system, and that's where this baseload thing becomes critical. If you have a more decentralized system, then you can try and play the different sources off against each other rather than having one big plant. Doesn't mean we don't need baseload, but I think there's more options there than we think about because we're used to the idea of just a few big plants, and if one goes down, you're in deep trouble. And that's clearly how ESCOM thinks. So a lot of this is like what's possible in the future, but the technology has done so much better than it used to that I think the long-term benefits, it's the transition costs we have to manage. The long-term benefits are pretty clear. Yeah, and I think that just if we could save 20% of our imports on liquid fuel, that would be great. You know, that would make a huge difference. And I think just to say finally, a lot of that is around creative destruction, that we're not good at dealing with creative destruction because the companies so creative destruction is when a new technology is arising and the big existing companies have to sell off assets ahead of time. And you can see it with ArcelorMittal and the mini mills as well, and a lot of these technologies. And the part of the problem is we get so lobbied by established businesses, we end up saying, let's protect them, rather than going with the new technology that will actually bring about change. And then finally on poverty and joblessness, so we're actually doing some work on this. I could probably send you a paper. Look, I would argue the critical thing is we need to think about the role of, because the ecosystem for new innovation for small business and for self-employment was destroyed, and for new kinds of products and all this technological change was actually destroyed under apartheid in many ways. You need to think about how do you recreate that ecosystem. So it's not just about saying, can we give some funding to small business, or can we give people just land? We have to talk about the whole thing as all of the services they need to use the land, all of the inputs they need to use the funds and the skills and that kind of support. And to me, that's about something government is not good at. So we need to think about what are the intermediaries that work, whether it's contracting out in agriculture, whether it's franchise operations in retail and food and other kinds of services, whether it's government services themselves, like where you're basically making government services more labor intensive by bringing in people at lower levels of skill. And all of these kinds of projects, and we need to be much more innovative about it. And the really big issues are, the really big challenges have always been the risk and the money, and those two things are related, and being innovative, which is very hard for departments. Like right now under government rules, it's really hard to fund an intermediary to do that kind of work, like just to get the money paid. And so to me, the issue is departments are really good at dealing with established business. It's very unclear who is responsible for creating new employment on a mass scale, creating new opportunities on a mass scale. Is it the DTIC? Is it agriculture? Is it social development? Is it municipalities? And until we have those clear outcome, impact targets that say this is what we need, then it's very hard to allocate those responsibilities and say somebody has to do it, who's going to do it, and how do we manage the risks so that we feel comfortable funding it? And I think those are the really big innovations we need if we're ever going to get there. So.
Thank you very much. I really wish that all members of the committee could make time. This was a very, very good meeting. And I think that concludes the business of today. We really appreciate, I'm sure over tea will then ask that question we've been asking, to what extent can you help sharpen the committee so that we were able to ask the right questions as we get into this new era of the new APP that we've spoken about. But I think we've done a lot of work ideologically to canvass the views between ourselves and the department, and we seem to be finding each other. So, but from there, we need an instrument to make sure that we can hold each other accountable. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Appropriation of land and
Yeah.
That was a good presentation. My name is Mondi.
Yeah.
And I study here in economics. I have a PhD in economics.
Yeah.
I'm also doing my PhD in economics.
Is it? With whom?
I'm done at the University of Reading in the UK.
Already? Wow. Okay.
I'd love to keep in touch.
Although economics, as you know, can be very much dominated by the global north,
Yes, it's true.
and so not so useful. I mean, coming up with stuff that's relevant to us.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, thanks as well.
Cool. Yeah.
Hi, Marco.